Okay, thank you. So we're going to move to the other end of the spectrum and talk about literacy with teenagers. As you may have noticed in the program, before I was a teacher educator, I taught Spanish for 10 years and then ESL for 10 years in an urban public school system in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so the focus of my talk this morning, I'm going to just try to illuminate best practices with adolescent English learners from around the world, in which it was my job to encourage them to love reading, and some of them already did love reading and some did not, but to embrace reading in English and to understand multiple genres in English, but mainly to just love reading as a source of entering multiple worlds and being able to learn about anything that you wanted to learn about. And so I'll tell you just a little bit about the learners. I had students in my high school who were from 40 different cultural and linguistic groups. That's common in this area as well. So these students had varied first language literacy strengths. Some of them came from very strong formal schooling backgrounds and were on grade level. And others had interrupted formal schooling. I had many refugee students from Somalia, from Myanmar, and from Nepal. The major refugee groups who were students who were still had either underdeveloped literacy in their first language and were developing literacy in English at the same time. So they really came from diverse backgrounds, but what they did share in common, and they were 14 to 21 years old, so they were able to stay in high school until they were 21. Some of them had been in the United States for 2 or 3 years, some of them for longer than that, and some of them had just arrived in the that school year, so it was their first experience in an American public high school. But they were all focused on their future. They were very curious, motivated, ambitious, wonderful young people who wanted to have a good life in America and wanted to continue their education after high school. So it was my job to help prepare them literacy-wise to be able to pursue their dreams. So on this slide, in a nutshell, I just took kind of what we know of best practices of literacy instruction with adolescent English learners, and I'm going to leave that slide up there as I just share some stories about my work with these students and how I tried to take theory into practice. Okay, so as all good secondary teachers know, you have to have a culture of respect and rapport with adolescents to be able to teach them in the first place. So you have to really care about them, you have to know their stories, you have to know their interests, and you have to make a space where it's okay to struggle to understand and grapple to make meaning and to say what you think and to not be criticized for it. It's important to draw on their social and cultural linguistic knowledge capitals. So their funds of knowledge, their ways of knowing, being, thinking, seeing, doing, communicating, believing, have to be acknowledged and honored in that classroom. And a synergy of approaches is important. So yes, we know that cognitive reading strategies, that's good readers visualize and they predict and they summarize, but that can't be the focus of the lesson. Those tools have to come up in context with the text that you are engaging with, okay? So importantly, it's literacy and comprehension is fostered when students interact with one another regularly, so in pairs and small groups consistently, and with me as the teacher. We're using scaffolds, and scaffolds includes our peers, right? Our peers are important scaffolds, and we're looking at the way that language works differently across texts. We're using language as a meaning-making resource. We're taking a critical stance. We're reading sometimes from a resistant perspective. We're questioning the author, and we're asking how the author's own perspective, the author's own history, who the author is, may inform the way that the author writes in a certain genre. So I'm going to leave that up there and just share with you first a short story that we read together, and then a novel that we read together, and a nonfiction text to kind of give you an idea of the kind of instruction that I think really was motivating and engaging for adolescents from all over the world to come into this classroom and say, here we read, and we talk about what we read, and we love reading, and we read outside of this classroom, and we talk about what we read outside of this classroom, and we're always reading something, and we're always sharing what we're reading, and we're talking and responding about what we're reading, okay? So the first one was that sticks out in my mind was a story about an African-American young woman who wanted to be an engineer. She wanted to go to a bridge building 5-week summer course, and she needed her grandmother, whom she lived with, to sign the permission slip. BB is the girl's name, and her parents were deceased, and the grandmother was caring for BB. And BB was about to graduate. She was going into her senior year of high school, and Grandma wanted BB. She thought this was complete nonsense. Why you would want to go to a building bridges program when you can have a job at the hair salon down the street for the summer, and after you graduate, that job is waiting for you. Those are Grandma's friends. They know about you, and that's where you can work. And that's not in BB's plans at all. So it's really a beautiful story that brought up so many different themes to talk about with teenagers from all over the world. So, for example, one morning, BB comes into the kitchen dressed for high school, and she has on a shirt where her belly button is showing and her jeans, and her grandma says to her, "How are you gonna land a man with that navel on parade?" And I chuckled like that, like many of you did, but I look up, and every English learner in the room, nobody's laughing. So I know they don't understand what Grandma said there. So it was a constant deconstruction of meaning. So I drew a picture on the board of a navel on parade, and they got that right away because there were many navels on parade in the high school. And so we talked a little bit then about, why certain females feel comfortable dressing in certain ways, and they were able to bring their perspective into that. And we talked about, so what does Grandma mean by land a man? What does that mean? And somebody knew that meant finding someone to marry. So it opened up a space for sharing from different cultural perspectives. Is it important to find a man to marry if you are a female? And how do you go about that? And what role does your family play in that? And in that room, there were many different answers to that question. So it was a beautiful space for building the idea that we have many different ways about going about life, and none of them is wrong or right. They're just different from one another. As Allison talked about, we were continually trying to build vocabulary. As many of you know, if you learn to read in another language, I learned to speak Spanish starting at age 15, and to learn to read in Spanish was very challenging. When you come across even a few words that you don't know, you're lost, right? So in this book, in this story, BB's grandma accused her of being foolish. And some of the students didn't know what foolish meant. So we always took opportunities, as Allison said, to turn and talk or to write. Give us an example of something foolish. Make a connection to your own life. So I remember this because a Cambodian boy in the room, he came up with a story. His family owned a restaurant in Pittsburgh, and his grandmother and he would go shopping for the groceries, for the vegetables for their restaurant. And so Grandma had a camera with her one day that she had in the vegetable bag, and the camera got kind of moist, and Grandma put the camera in the microwave to dry it out. And so he said, "I think this is an example of something that is foolish." And in that same story, we came across the word impoverished, and they hadn't seen that word before. So I wrote the word poverty, and they did know the word poverty. They knew that it was connected to being poor. So we talked about the way that impoverished is connected semantically to that word, but it is, it's an adjective. And one of the students from Nepal said, so when we were in the refugee camp and it burned down and we had to live in the forest for 2 months, we were impoverished. Yes, that's an example of that word. So we just engaged in discussion continually. I wanted to share with you about a novel that we read that they really loved by Gary Soto, a young adult fiction author, and this novel was called The Afterlife. And the main character in this novel is a young teenage boy named Chewy, who is murdered in his school at a dance over a pair of shoes. So it's a very horrible, senseless act of violence. And there's another girl in the story, Crystal, who commits suicide. In our high school, each year we had 2 or 3 students who committed suicide. It was something that teenagers wanted to talk about, and maybe often didn't have a space to talk about. So Chewy and Crystal are spirits, and they are slowly disappearing, but they can still see their life on Earth. And at one point, Chewy's mom, who is in a state of deep grief, says to Chewy's cousin, she hands the cousin something wrapped in a towel and says, "You need to do what you need to do." And so again, we didn't understand because English isn't our first language. It was a perfect opportunity to talk about inferencing and to figure out. So we have to figure out what is in that towel and what is it that Chewy's mom wants Chewy's cousin to do. In the meantime, Chewy is, as a spirit, trying to communicate with his cousin to not do what the mother wants him to do. So we are able to eventually figure out that there's a gun in that towel, and that the mom wants the person who killed Chewy to be killed as revenge. And so it opened up such a space, this novel, for talking about revenge, for example, as a response to violence. Is that an appropriate response? Do we think, in this world, that violence creates more violence? When we use violence as a response, are we creating more violence? Do we have any examples of that in the world around us? We talked about the universality of grief and how people who are in grief feel very similarly. At the same time, we also talked about different beliefs about what happens after you die, and what different burial practices are. So all of these things, just, children from Cambodia and China and Somalia and Myanmar and the Dominican Republic, and we're all talking together about the kind of beliefs that we have about what happens after you die. So I say all that to say that it was very important to engage teenagers in reading about subjects that interest them, and to make it so they're not easier text. They're teenagers, they're just learning English, but it's very important that the texts are on grade level and rigorous, but that you spend time deconstructing meaning with them. We did the same kind of thing for informational text. So I remember one story, or I'm sorry, not a story, an expository text was called Add Power, and it was entitled, Are You Buying It? So it had its own double meaning. And we looked at the way that language is used to persuade, and our role as consumers, and the consumerism of American society, and sharing our perspectives about that. One student shared how they had been in the United States about 2 years. This young man was from Nepal, and his father had ordered a diamond ring online, thinking that it was really a real diamond ring. It was something like he paid $45 for it or something like that online, and was very disappointed to find out that it wasn't, a real diamond ring. So we really talked about how can we be discerning readers? How do we decide what's true and what isn't true, and what sources we can trust and what sources we cannot trust? And so we read also another effective method is using text sets that tap into the same theme. So in this advertisement theme, how do the media influence the way that we think, was an essential question that we kept coming back to. We read a poem by Alice Walker called Without Commercials, in which she challenges the image of beauty that is promoted in the media as being just one certain way, and talking about beauty really coming from within yourself. And we read an essay by a Latino man named Carlos Cortez, who was talking about the way that the media projects negative images of minorities very often. And so in that story, it provoked, that was at the time that Trayvon Martin had been killed by George Zimmerman, and the students had heard about that, and they wanted to know more about that. So we read a news story about it. Then we found a video on YouTube that was kind of a reenactment, but it had real pictures of Trayvon and George Zimmerman, and they were flabbergasted when they saw those pictures side by side. How is it possible that anybody could think that Trayvon Martin was a threat to George Zimmerman? he weighs like 200 more pounds than him. They were just really astonished by it, and it brought up a conversation too that I'm almost out of time, but I really do want to share this one with you. The group of Somali boys were aspiring rappers, and they were rapping in their language, their tribal language, which was Kisigua, and they called themselves Little Kisiguas. And they actually had connected with an artist who had a recording studio, and he was teaching them about recording. And so they were talking about how rappers sometimes have a bad, image. And so I was talking with them a little bit about the way that rap music actually can be very derogatory towards women and can promote violence. And I found an African American woman history professor at the University of Pittsburgh who came in and gave a great talk about that. And she showed them that actually, I learned something I didn't know. The main producers of rap music were really the ones who were demanding this type of music from rappers, that this is the music that's going to sell. So we talked about, your role as a consumer, that we all have a role. If we're purchasing that kind of music, then we're also promoting those perspectives. And so the Somali young men said to me, Mrs. Ramos, we promise you, we will not say anything bad about women, no bad words, and no violence in our rap music. So we were asked to just include some recommendations, and I'll end with the recommendations that really reflect best practices that we know from research. So when you read and you want to create a culture of reading with adolescent English learners, in my experience, keeping these 3 R's in mind is very important. So the lessons have to be rigorous. They have to be a wide variety of text on many subjects from different genres that are grade level. They have to be relevant to the students. They have to connect to what they want to learn and read about. And you have to build relationships between you, the teacher, and the students among themselves. And thank you for listening.